Good morning, everybody. Now, I will be reading the Bible as I go through my sermon, and it's mostly from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, which we've been looking at with the fasting and the prayer. And I'm going to be talking about giving and holiness, and hopefully making the connection between the two. I also have really enjoyed preparing this sermon because as I've been thinking about giving, the thing that's really struck me is that for every gift that's given, someone gets to receive. And Kerry and I have been missionaries for over 20 years, and so we've lived off the gifts that people have given us. And taking time to remember those gifts has been a real joy. But before we get started, I do want to actually talk a little bit about growth, because we've been talking about prayer, we've been talking about fasting, we've been talking about growing in holiness as we do it. And one of the things that I wanted to express is when I talk about giving, like in your questions in your home groups, it's not transactional. It's not that if you give, this result happens. But we know that it's God who changes us from the inside out. That doesn't mean we have no role to play. It just means that it doesn't usually happen by us trying really hard to be good at something. And the picture that we find in the Bible is one of a farmer. And we probably don't, any of us have farms, but I know at least Robin loves to grow, is it tomatoes you love to grow? Yeah, he loves to grow tomatoes. So if you take a seed, you can plant it in a good spot, which has got good soil, and you can water the tomato plant. And then, if it's warm, the conditions are right, it will grow. But you do not actually have power to make the seed grow. It's God that makes things grow. So when we're having these talks about practically what can we do about holiness, this is what we're talking about. What environment do we put ourselves in that enables us to grow? And so I want you to remember that as we're talking about giving, this is part of what we can do to put ourselves in the place where it's good and healthy and encourages the growth that God has for us. Okay, so I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 6. It's only a few verses, and then I'll come back to the next verses when I get to them. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. So I just want you to take a moment to try to imagine the situation that Jesus is talking about. You might find it helpful to literally imagine the situation in the first century in Jerusalem or elsewhere in Israel. Or you might find it helpful to think about a busy place in your own experience. And it's about giving to the needy. Now, you might be in the story as someone who is wealthy. And you could be someone who's wealthy, who has been or is being like the hypocrites. But you could be someone who's wealthy looking on, who actually gives quietly, who gives generously, but is watching this play out. Or you could just be an ordinary person, someone which has some finances but not lots, looking on. How do you perceive what the rich people announcing things are doing? Do you see them as people to be looked up to be emulated because they are holy in what they're doing? Or are you somebody who has very little, and what you have really relies on the kindness of others? How do you see this playing out? Are you encouraged because perhaps some of this will actually filter down to you so you can eat for the day? When I'm thinking about their context, I actually see that ordinary people will be looking up at these people with the fanfare as those that are good leaders. And Jesus is completely turning this on its head. And then I ask myself, why does Jesus call them hypocrites? It's easy to say, oh, they're doing this badly, but why are they hypocrites? And when I ask that question, I see that they are getting praise for being seen to be holy because of what they are giving. But what actually should be happening is that God is getting praise for what he is giving because everything they have received has ultimately been first given to them by God. I just want us to take a moment and ask you, how many breaths do you think you've taken today? You know, I don't need an answer, but just think about it. We've taken a lot of breaths today. But every breath that we have taken has been given by God. And if every breath that we have has been given by God, everything that we have is being given by God and ultimately by God. And is ultimately God's. And so this contrast between giving in public and giving in secret has an underlying issue. Is, are you doing this for yourself and for your benefit? Or are you doing it for God and for his benefit? So where is your heart at in your giving? So my talk today is not about how much you should give, when you should give, or to whom you should give. But with what heart should you give? With what attitude should you give? And that is a much harder thing because we don't actually have much control over by our heart when we do things. But I know from experience, when we walk with God and we ask him to help us change our heart to match what we want it to be when we are doing good things, that actually our heart follows. And we'll look a little bit more at that when a little bit later. So I wanted to give you two encouragements, actually three encouragements. So the first actually is more, there's one bit where I'm actually going to be challenging you to do something different. Now, everyone will have a different experience of giving and be in different places. But if you're in a place where you have never really started to give as a spiritual discipline, now is the time to start. For me and Kerry, it wasn't that we hadn't given before, because we can give, but it still not be a spiritual discipline. So we joined Agape about 20 years ago, and a bit more. And when we did, we had to learn how to give because we needed to ask people to support us in what we were doing. And the main thing we learned was, actually, we're not putting into practice something that we're commanded to do. And so we took away from that a conviction to start giving as a spiritual discipline, which we did. And we had some money that was saved up, so we were able to go through a process where we gave more than our income, because we probably didn't have an income at the time, in faith. And then we continued to give when we started to have an income. And that was the start for us. It wasn't about giving a lot. It wasn't about a big show, but it was about getting started. And so if you're not giving as a spiritual discipline on a regular basis, now is the time. Even if you start with £5 a month, doesn't matter who to or where to, it's that sense of, I am making this commitment to live in a different way. The second thing is, it's experiences from somebody who has received a lot. The first one is actually gifts can make a massive difference in the life of those that receive it. Now, a few years ago, we had a really dodgy car, and we needed to get rid of the car and get a new car. But we were used to buying old cars, and they were kind of cheap to run, but they didn't always get us to the places we wanted to get to. And we had a friend who decided to help us with the process so that we would actually be able to get to the places we needed to get. And they helped us in buying a car. Now, this was a significant sum of money, and it was a real blessing to us because it has made our life so much better. And we still have the result of that gift. The second thing is about anonymous gifts. So most of the gifts we receive are not actually anonymous, but some of them are anonymous. There was one Christmas day, in fact this has probably happened more than once, where we got back from church and found an envelope with cash on the doorstep. It wasn't a life-changing amount, but it was significant and enabled us to enjoy Christmas in a different way. But the key thing is, there's just a real joy in the surprise and the encouragement, because the gifts we receive is not just about the finance, it's also about the other effects that they have on us. It's just a real joy in being part of God's family and receiving in that way. There's also a sense when we receive, we're not specifically thanking for the person, although that's given, although that's there. The overwhelming thing is we're thanking God for what he is doing and also really enjoying the beauty of the love that the person giving is showing for God in what they're doing. And so when we give, we can have that God-centered approach. And certainly those that are receiving would usually have that kind of attitude. At least I hope they would. So now I want to move on to the next bit, which is actually in Mark 12. And this is about the widow's mite, and I'm going to read it to you. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." Now, the first thing you'll notice is she didn't actually do this in secret, but she did do it with the attitude that God is calling us to have, which is God-centered, selfless, as opposed to being selfish, self-centered. And the reason I wanted to raise this was because the gifts that we give are not measured by the amount it is. So this woman gave significantly out of what she had. And what she gave seems significant. I suppose it's a bit like the offering plate going around, and you're putting 2 pennies into the plate, and perhaps there's like a pile of 10 and 20 pound notes next to it. And it's really easy for us that put 2 pence in to feel as though it lacks significance. But that is not what God says. God says that this woman gave more than those who gave because she gave out of what she had. And for someone who's received gifts, we take pleasure not just in the amount that's given, but in quirky things. So there's 2 aspects to this that we've experienced. One is when you get like a really unusual amount. So rather than, say, getting £500, you get £453.22. And the reason I kind of remember that kind of thing is because it means that someone has been actually really thoughtful and really deliberate about what they've got, and they're sharing it out amongst the people they want to give, and there's just a real strong act of devotion in that. And I don't know whether they'd even realise that the impact it has, but it's really special and powerful. The other side of it is when you have someone that you know that hasn't got very much money, and they pledge to give, say, £5 a month. Now, £5 a month is a drop in the ocean that's really indistinguishable against the whole. But it speaks such a great encouragement because everything that you give has value. Not just in the actual amount, but in the act of giving and what it says about God and the encouragements that it brings. And that's why all of us, however much we've got, can give. Because when I was talking about starting to give and starting the practice, the spiritual practice of giving, it could just be a tiny amount because that's what you have. But in giving it, you're engaging in that discipline, and you're placing yourself in the field with the good conditions to grow. And then I just want to finish by talking about, we're going back to Matthew 6 now, because it leads into this. And this is about what happens when you give. Because we get told to store our treasure in heaven. So I'm going to read this to you as well. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so on the one hand, you've got us having money which we store up here. And actually, when you're rich, which I am not, although compared to most of the world I am, then it's really stressful because you can lose it. It can be taken from you. When you don't have that, you don't worry about it. So it's a little bit foolish to store up our treasure here. But God says there is a treasure that you can store in heaven which can never be taken away from you. And I think this is a really strange way to concept because we on earth think about treasure as storing up houses, about big bank balances, nice cars, nice things. We know we can't take them with us, but then we imagine that in heaven. So we're imagining a big house in heaven probably not with a car, because I'm sure they've got better transport. But they've got, you have things, and we're thinking things when we think of heaven. And I think Jesus uses those words because he knows that, and he knows he wants us to store up things in heaven. But when you look at Jesus, is he rich in those ways? He is not rich in those ways, but he is rich in other ways. And he, I'm sure, has more treasure in heaven than us all put together. So what is treasure in heaven. And what does it mean for us to put our treasure in there and for our heart to be there in heaven? And I don't know whether I have got the right answer to this question, but I find it very helpful to think about it like this. When I invest in things of the kingdom of heaven, whether I put my money there or whether I actively do things, when I'm in heaven, I will be able to experience the benefit of those things. Now, each of one of us will have different stories and different experiences, but my experiences, I was at university, and there was a friend called Ben. Now, Ben was in the Christian Union, and he loved God, and I was not in the Christian Union, and I didn't love God, not in the way that he did. And he took time to share about Jesus with me. Now, Ben is alive. I'm not exactly sure where he lives, but I have not really seen him to talk to him about this since I have become a Christian. And this is 20 years ago. So when I'm in heaven, I am looking forward to getting alongside Ben and telling him all of the stories of what impact he's had on my life and what that then has impacted other people's lives as a result. That is what I like to think of, is what do I store up in heaven? So when I give to mission work, what fruit does that bear? I don't know. Most of you won't know. But when in heaven, you're going to be able to count that because you'll be able to talk to people about it. And we experience this on earth because sometimes you have an impact on people's lives. It's one of the privileges of clergy, but it's not just us. I mean, you'll have had experiences where you've impacted someone's life and they've come to you and they've thanked you for that impact. I know how amazing that feels, and we will get more of that in heaven. So where you put your treasure, if it's in heaven, that will never be taken away. Now my mouth's getting dry, which means I really should be finishing. And so I just want to leave you with that one thing. If you aren't giving as a spiritual discipline, start today, start small, and be encouraged that whatever you give, it will make a difference. Whether it's just an encouragement or something else. The second thing is, this isn't about how much you give, who you give to, or when you give. It's about your heart attitude when you give. No one else can see what your heart is like. You need to ask yourself and ask God about that. And where you see it's lacking God, where there's something that pulls you away in a self-centered way, give that to God, and over time, ask him increasingly to give you his heart for giving. It's like Adam and Alice have been talking about. It's we're exchanging our will for God's will, but in the area of giving. And the last thing is, every gift is received by someone. So all the gifts you have given, be encouraged. Be encouraged about the impact it has had on the person who's received it. And be excited about when you are in heaven, or the new creation, I'm not talking about that today, but when you are there with God, actually what joy that will be to hear and relate to each other the impacts your gifts have had. Let me pray. Father God in heaven, I want to thank you so much that you first gave to us, and that creates the basis of all that we give. You are so good. We love you. We worship you. Speak to us in our hearts about being generous. And speak to us in our hearts so that our hearts will be where our treasure is put, and that it will be in heaven. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.